Well, thank you folks for coming tonight, and thank you to our gracious host, the Wood County Museum. You know, when I started to think about America 250, at the Park District talking about programming ideas, I work at the Carter Historic Farm. To introduce myself, I'm the Historic Agricultural Specialist as part of one of 21 parks in the Wood County Park District. But the Carter Historic Farm specifically, right, interprets the 1930s agriculture. So we not only have a home where we interpret the actual material objects, but we also do the agriculture as well, right? So this summer and spring, I'll be out there with a two-bottom plow, actually plowing up the dirt the way they would have in the 1930s. So when I was thinking about, what to do for America 250, and as we're on kind of the edge of the Great Depression itself becoming 100 years old, I thought it was a perfect time to do a series on the Great Depression specifically. And so as you can see here, grab a flyer on your way out. This will be actually the first of 12 individual lectures on the Great Depression. We'll start here in January. Today's topic obviously being farmers in the 1920s. So the next couple months I'll give you the preface. We'll start in the 20s, and then by the end of it in December, we'll finish with the beginning of World War II, which really brought the United States out of the Great Depression. All right, so to begin, like I said, we're going to be talking a lot about kind of commodity markets and what the rural economy looked like in the 1920s. And of course, as everything in history, if you know anything, as historians say, nothing occurs in a vacuum, right? So you can't just look at agriculture in the 20s and assume that the conditions that surrounded it kind of propped themselves up. It's built on a series of kind of, in this case, global events that kind of shift the way that farmers in Wood County or anywhere across the United States are kind of doing business. And of course, the first event that really signals a change in American agriculture is the First World War. It begins in 1914. As you can see here is a map of kind of the breakdown. And while it's not really, this is going to be a lecture on World War I, it's important for the context, right? And so America, as we'll talk about, doesn't enter the First World War immediately, right? It starts in 1914, a very complicated series of kind of intercontinental disputes that we could spend the next 2 hours talking about. But all you need to know is that a few European powers started to fight amongst themselves, right? The Central Powers and the Allied Powers, which the United States will later join, right? This is important when you're talking about American farmers, because European farmers are going to be kind of be decimated by the war itself, right? Not only are many of them going to be conscripted into their various armies, but the actual farmland is going to be destroyed, whether it's building trenches or the kind of warfare. Okay, and so Europe as a continent is going to be hit with a series of labor shortages of farmers. They're also going to be hit with naval blockades that kind of prevent the flow of agrarian goods, and they're also going to be hit with kind of widespread famine. Okay, and so in 1914, America is going to have a response to this. What do American farmers? What is our obligation with this war in Europe? So these two individuals, right, are going to be kind of the early phase of World War I. What is the American farmer's role in this conflict? Well, the gentleman to your left, President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, is going to be kind of part of that isolationist camp, that the United States is not going to enter into the war, right? He's worried that it's going to polarize the American electorate. He runs in 1916 on the campaign of "He kept us out of the war," right? He's making these promises that there will not be American boots on the ground, right? He wants to have peace without victory. He doesn't want to have to conquer anybody, right? The United States is going to supply goods to the Allied cause, right? But we're not going to be kind of entangled in this intervention. A long-standing tradition dating back to George Washington that the United States should not allow itself to be engulfed in kind of European affairs, right? We want to be our own nation, sovereign nation, avoid all of that kind of conflict. Now, the gentleman on the right, who we will continue to talk about for the next couple months, right, Herbert Hoover, is also going to be kind of involved in this World War effort, but from a more kind of private citizen approach. Hoover makes his money in Australia in the gold mines. He's a private citizen of the United States, concerned about starvation in the European continent during the war. He sets up a foundation or kind of a logistical operation called the Commission for Relief in Belgium in 1914. And essentially what his plan is to make sure that Europeans on the European continent do not starve. He's largely successful. He saves millions of lives through his kind of efforts to, he negotiates from a neutral party with Britain and Germany to allow food to kind of cross in. He's kind of lauded as a great humanitarian, and eventually Wilson will kind of pick up on this and appoint him later, as we'll talk about, to the director of the Food Administration, where he's going to apply those lessons learned in Europe to the United States. But of course, the United States is going to join the First World War, and there's going to be a few events that kind of pull us into that conflict. Again, not a lesson on World War I, but just to summarize, if it's been a while since your high school history class, right? There's a series of events that lead America to joining the war, despite the overwhelming kind of sentiment that we don't want to be in. Wilson's arguing we're not going in, right? There's a sinking of the USS Lusitania in 1915 by German submarines that kind of enrage Americans. American lives are lost in this conflict, right? The Germans are going to say that, well, America was shipping munitions, and America's going to say no. Well, later we find out they were. Right, but it does claim the lives of Americans. This enrages Americans, right? There's also the discovery of a Zimmerman telegram sent from the Germans to the Mexicans that essentially argues, hey, if we declare war on the United States, how about you declare war on the United States too, right? And you fight them on the southern front, they're not so worried about us anymore, and we'll give you back some of those territories you lost a couple decades ago, right? And there's also this kind of guiding principle among Woodrow Wilson himself, and he believes in the protection of democracy in kind of international capitalism, this free trade enterprise that he believes is kind of the essence of the United States. And so they use these, and the American tide or opinion changes, and America enters the war in 1917, right? It's been going on for 3 years at this point, started in 1914. The Americans arrive in 1917. They declare war in early April 1917, and American boots on the ground follow quickly after. But what's important for this presentation is just a few weeks after Wilson kind of declares war in Europe. He says to farmers, and I quote, "Upon the farmers of this nation rests the fate of the war and the fate of all nations," right? He's making a desperate plea to Americans that we're not only going to have to feed everybody at home, but now we're responsible to feeding the rest of the Western world, essentially. And essentially, he's making the plea to farmers that by producing goods, by doing what you do best, right, it's not only a patriotic duty, but it's also offering you an economic opportunity, right? The whole world needs our food, our allies in the West need our food, and we have the ability to kind of provide them with that. That's the international context as this kind of poster, the classic song Over There, right? We're coming, the Yanks are coming, we're coming over there. They're arguing that same thing to a farmer, right? The plow is your weapon. You might not go and fight in the trenches of Belgium, but you can fight in the furrows of Northwest or of Northwest Ohio, right? Of anywhere across the Midwest. And so to get this kind of productivity up to speed, how are farmers going to feed Americans? How are they going to feed the Western world? Well, the federal government is going to get involved, and they're going to argue a few things. That farmers are going to have to increase their mechanization, right? Tractors are very new on the market. By the 1910s, most people, if they have a steam engine, right, are kind of popular. Henry Ford is going to popularize the gasoline-powered tractor. It's going to be made affordable. So we're going to give you money as a farmer to buy those machines. You're going to be able to crank out more food production. Not only that, we're going to give you loans so you can expand the amount of acreage you have in cultivation. We want as much land as possible planted. That way we can feed the allies and ourselves. We're going to bolster the use of synthetic fertilizers, right? You're not going to have to worry about producing enough fertilizer homegrown, whether that be your hogs or your cattle, right? We're going to give you loans to buy these new technologically advanced synthetic fertilizers. And we're also going to subsidize your commodity prices to make sure that not only is this a patriotic duty, but one in which you make money, right? And there's a few things that the Americans are going to export that is desperately needed. The biggest being wheat, right? Wheat feeds people, makes bread. That's what we're going to focus on. They're also going to focus on oats to feed the horses that are involved in the war effort. Beef and pork, American beef and pork are going to feed the Allied troops, right? Butter and lard are going to be used as a kind of sustaining force. And then hay and cottonseed meal, again, American products are going to bolster the war effort. So if there's an international angle to this, there's also a domestic application of such, right? If the federal government is now arguing you must produce more food faster, most land under cultivation, how are we going to do that? Well, the United States is going to, and through the federal government, right, encourage these things, mostly through loans, as we'll talk about. The first being is that mechanization element, right? A team of horses is not going to produce as much food as a gasoline-powered tractor, right? But you might be wondering, as a farmer in 1918, how am I going to afford a tractor? Well, we'll give you loans. And those loans between 1914 and 1918 allow farmers to buy about 146,000 tractors annually. Right? For 4 years, the factories that are making the tractors and the farmers who are buying them at kind of bulwark speed. Right? The average cost at this time is about $1,000, which is today about $32,000 for a tractor. And if anybody is involved in agriculture, it'd be nice to pay $32,000 for a new John Deere, right? It's not quite that price anymore, I don't think. They're going to also incentivize that maximum production. How do we get the most land possible under cultivation? Well, we're going to encourage, right, it's a patriotic duty, and as a result of that, wheat, right, being that big commodity that I was talking about, is going to expand its acreage pretty massively, right? In 1915, right after the war begins, about 40 million acres in the United States are dedicated to wheat production. By the war's end in 1918, it's going to be 76 million acres, right? That's a pretty large jump in just a few years' time. There's going to be a few kind of price supports passed through the United States Congress, one of which is going to kind of legalize this extension of loans through kind of local agents. The other is going to make sure that that wheat that we want to send overseas is going to be price lock guaranteed, right? And so the price is going to be set at $2.26 a bushel for wheat. And we see this kind of have an effect on the rural economy, the farmer economy, right? Wheat in 1914, about 90 cents a bushel. As I just said, by the war's end, it's almost $3. The gross income for wheat farmers in this country in 1914 was $500 million. In 1919, it was $2 billion. It was a $2 billion industry that grew overnight to meet this war demands. And so farmers in the United States during World War I, not only fighting for country, but also enjoying the benefits on the pocketbook, right? They're, for the first time, seeing a parity in the amount that it takes to put land into cultivation and what they receive. It's more than 100%. They're making more money than it costs to put seeds in the ground. Unimaginable today, right? I mean, really good stuff. And so farmers not only are enjoying this kind of international market, which they have not had access to at this kind of rate before, but also American policymakers, those in Washington, D.C., the President, Secretary of State, also have broader goals for American agriculture. This map here, produced in 1918, kind of summarizes those goals pretty easily, right? You can see here that the countries that are kind of were engulfed in this conflict are color-coded, those in black having the most demand for agrarian foodstuffs. And this pledge here in the middle, the American Food Pledge, is pledging to American farmers and to its allies in Europe that American farmers are going to guarantee you 20 million tons of foodstuffs for the foreseeable future, right? If you're an American farmer, this is awesome. I've got good prices, and Europe needs another 20 million, right? They're decimated by the war. It's going to take them a long time to recover. It's going to take them a long time to get farmers back into the fields. This gives me a guaranteed market for my goods. If you're policymakers, right, you have an obligation to further those alliances with Western Europe, right? Countries like Great Britain and France, right, are now not only indebted to you for coming over and aiding in the war effort, but now you're feeding their citizens, right, keeping them from starvation. People like Herbert Hoover are going to be remembered as the humanitarian who allowed Belgian children to not die in their cities, right? This is good for America. It's good for its farmers. But in 1920, just 2 years after the war ends, there's going to be a couple of shocks that come to the farmers and the United States that are going to make sure that this dream does not become a reality, right? Out of their control, but kind of the shifting geopolitical features of Western Europe are going to make it so. The first is going to be on the domestic realm. And in 1920, for the first time in the United States' history, more people are going to live in urban centers than in the rural countryside, right? Up until 1920, okay, from 1776 to 1920, more people were farmers. Everybody lived in the countryside, right? This was both an express goal of some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, who is arguing that, his form of agrarian republicanism, this grand idea that everybody should be a farmer, right? It doesn't work out that way. Obviously, the trajectory of history pushes many people to the cities. And for the first time in 1920, this becomes a reality. This kind of cartoon is depicting such, right? The farmer is strong and healthy, and he's carrying the city population on the left-hand side, but on the right, he's a little older, a little weaker, and the cities have grown up. They've gotten too big, and the farm population has gotten older and too small. To give you some context, in 1950, about 54 million people lived in the cities. That's 51%. In urban or in the rural countryside, it was about 52 million, or 49%. In 2020, okay? Just 6 years ago, 265 million, or 80% of our Americans, lived in urban areas, and only 66 million of us, or 20%, live in rural areas. So it's only gotten worse since 1920. The gentleman who created this cartoon, I would love to see his take now on the division between urban centers and rural areas. Yeah, flattened completely, right? But this is also going to have an impact on agriculture, obviously, right? 1900, just 20 years before the transition to a more urbanized country, right? 40% of all Americans were farmers. You know, just a little under half of all people in this country, their primary occupation was creating food. In 1920, it's dropped 10% to about 30% of Americans being farmers. That means in 1920, one farmer fed 8 to 10 Americans, okay? Quite a noble task with the kind of mechanized equipment you have at the time. Many people were still using horses, right? Feeding 8 to 10 people, including your own family, is a task. To give you some context, in 2025, that number has jumped from one farmer to 169 Americans, right? It's only gotten worse, okay? And so this is not only an issue in 1920, but we can talk about maybe later, it's an issue today, right? This kind of occurring trend. It's going to start here in the 1920s, work its way through the Great Depression and onward. Again, to emphasize what this kind of transition had on the culture too, right, is that not only are people worried about what does the United States look like if more people live in the cities, right, but now you have a returning population of World War I veterans who have seen, and many of them farmers themselves, what the cities can offer, right? This song here is kind of a poster for a song that was very popular in 1919. It was How You Keep 'Em Down on the Farm. Okay, the chorus is there. I won't sing it for you, but you can surely read it, right? And it expresses, the song does, and it was very popular, the disillusionment that American veterans felt returning to places like Ohio, Nebraska, Iowa, after spending summers or days in places like Paris, right? The song talks about who would want to go back and pick up the pitchfork or the rake, right, after you've had a night out in Paris. I mean, nobody wants to do that, right? And so it talks about this worry, is not only do you have a shortage of individuals living in rural areas, you have a shortage of farmers, right? Many of them are moving to the cities for job opportunities or burgeoning industries that are built all across the Rust Belt, you know, Toledo, Detroit, Chicago. But now you have this younger generation of World War I veterans who are also not going to want to return to the farm. So there's this real crisis in kind of the American cultural zeitgeist of what do we do about this issue, okay? And so I mentioned that this was one of the shocks. The second, and I'll show you a series of graphs, is going to be the more important one for farmers. In 1920, we're going to see the cratering of American agriculture for a couple of reasons. The first being, and the primary one being, is that Europe recovers way quicker than the Americans thought they would, right? They thought, when I showed you that map, 20 million tons, that it was going to take Western Europe many years to kind of rebuild up their agricultural industries. That's not the case. They get back to business pretty quick, right? The war ends in 1918. By 1920, they're almost self-sufficient, okay? And so all of these farmers who have built up the last few years a good sizable chunk of cash, right, are now faced with the reality that they have no external market for all of this product that they're producing, right? And so not only has the American federal government told them to get bigger, they've given them loans to buy more equipment, and they've mortgaged their land to ensure, right, with the kind of fanciful belief that this market would always be there. We see it's not the case, right? You don't have to be a mathematician or a statistician to understand that a drop like that is not very good, right? So the international market in 1920 almost craters for the Americans, right? This is obviously going to have adverse effects. It's going to affect income, as you can see here, right? A drop in 1920 in real farm income in the United States, right? I'll make you look at them too long. And then the last one, if it'll switch, is being debt, okay? This is the graph you want to see go down. This one goes up, right? Income's down, external markets are down, debt is up, right? And so the rest of this kind of lecture that we'll talk about is how American farmers are going to deal with this reality, right? That we've lost our international market in Europe, that we now have been saddled with this debt that it took me to buy the land, my neighbor's land that I gobbled up to make more wheat. I've lost that market that guarantees me $2 for a bushel of wheat. That's surely going to end, right? And now, not only farmers are going to have to deal with this issue, but policymakers themselves, is that we've encouraged farmers to make more, and now we have too much of that, food stuff, right? We have nowhere to put it. How do you handle that, right? Pretty basic economics. You have too much of something, right? Supply and demand. Things are not going to turn out very well. And so this is going to have a few effects, right? I don't read the paper that much anymore, as much as they publish, right? But I do love these old cartoons. I think that's something we've lost, right? These kind of these political-minded cartoons. But this one from the 1920s, right, is talking about the realities of farmers, right? That represents the city skyline full of industry as money, 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 and the farmer is foreclosing, right? And of course, with any cartoon, there is some reality to that. Farm foreclosures are going to be one of the biggest signs that something bad is happening in the countryside. Remember, as we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks, the Great Depression is not going to begin really until 1929. And so we're talking about almost a decade before that, right? There being issues on the horizon. The first going to be the rural economy. Farm foreclosures between 1913 and 1920, right at the war's end. About 3 farms per 1,000 are going to be foreclosed upon, right? In 1926 alone, that's going to jump to 17 farms per 1,000 are going to be foreclosed upon, right? A growing kind of sign that things are going bad in the rural economy. Farm debts during that same time period, right, 1913 to 1920, mortgage debt per acre is going to increase by 135%. Okay, all that land they expanded upon, all of that mortgage they took out, the debt per acre up 135%. 2/3 of American farms at this time are operating at a loss. You know, the vast majority, 67%, are not making a profit. After 4 years of good profit, we're down to the vast majority of us not making any money at all. And of course, there's going to be causes to any of this, right? And for these, there's a few. The biggest being that declining commodity market, right? Those markets where we were guaranteed that good paying money for corn, wheat, and oats, vice versa, right? 1919, the price of wheat, $2.34 a bushel. 1920, it's down to $1.65. Corn in 1919, $1.30 a bushel. Corn in 1920, 47 cents a bushel. That one hurts, right? Minnesota gross cash income. Okay, this is for all their farmers. Some of the best data comes from some historians in Wisconsin or in Minnesota who sat down to do this. Gross income for all farmers in 1918 in Minnesota, $438 million. In 1922, just 2 years later, it's down to $229 million, right? Almost a loss of $200 million. Another cause of this, right? So you have declining commodity markets, you're making more produce, but you can't sell it for a good price, is also that acreage expansion, right? Those taking on of mortgages guaranteed by the federal government. Most farmers at the time borrowed at about 5 to 7% interest to expand that acreage. In 1920, about 52%, again, Minnesota, all farmers are mortgaged. 37% nationally, right? There was a kind of period before this, that 40 years before that, it was kind of taboo to mortgage your farm, right? You want to be able to pay it off. And now we're seeing this increasing. To become or to maintain kind of profitability, you have to take out mortgages. And so now they're saddled with those mortgages with the kind of realities of the market. They also finance the mechanization element, right? Where back in the day, you used a team of horses, you grew your own food, right? They ate the hay, they ate the grass, right? Tractors take gasoline, you have those now extended or expanded kind of operational expenditures, right? The loans that you have to pay back on the tractor you bought from Mr. Henry Ford and the maintenance on those tractors as well, right? Yeah?
Brief question.
Yes, sir.
World War I, there was a draft, a national draft, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was a farmer, a young man who was a farmer, was he deferred from the draft?
I don't know off the top. I would imagine so in probably most cases, right? If you had more than one son, I would imagine that the likelihood that the fourth would get out is no. But same thing like in World War II as well, right? There's deferments for agricultural laborers as well, right?
Young men who were deferred from the draft.
I don't know the statistic off the top. I would imagine so. That's probably the case. I would imagine. Again, right? We're fighting that war on the home front as well. But yeah, that's a good point as well. And so we have all these issues, right? Foreclosures are up. Markets are down, people aren't making money. We'll talk now about how farmers are going to respond to these challenges, right? Farmers have a say, all right? They always have, always will. But it's how they respond to those challenges that are going to be interesting for the 1920s. The first that we'll look at is mostly a grassroots organization of those small family farmers, right? At this point, most people are family farmers, but we're getting into that period of American agricultural history where people are going to start growing, right? There's going to be distinctions now between the smallest farmers and the biggest ones, okay, where there weren't before. So in the 1920s, the small farmers are going to be much more militant than the big farmers. And the best case study for that is going to be the Nonpartisan League in the upper Midwest, specifically North Dakota. And so small farmers are going to be very politically active during this period. They're going to be organized around left-wing political coalitions to improve farm prices and rural conditions for their people that live in the countryside, right? Their main goal is that they want to increase that farmer's income and through what they see as state-run facilities and price supports, right? That kind of reliance that they had on the federal government, there's no reason that should all dry up now is what these small farmers are arguing, right? Why return to what it was before, totally free market? We like those supports. It keeps us in business. It keeps us on the land, right? And importantly, they sought to limit the political influence and the corporatization of places like Chicago, where all your meat packers and your kind of your agrarian hub is, right? They're saying that the businessmen in Chicago and Minneapolis have too much money, and we don't have enough, right? We should bring some of those profits home and cut out the middleman. So the Nonpartisan League is formed in North Dakota in 1915 by a gentleman named Arthur C. Townley. He is a former activist with the Socialist Party of the United States, right? Okay. During this period, the Socialist Party did gain some, it's crazy to think about now, but gained some prevalence, right, in places like North Dakota. He forms the organization on behalf of small farmers and merchants, right, to regain control of kind of the agricultural economy and its political interests. They have quite a bit of success. In 1916 in North Dakota, the Nonpartisan League wins the governorship. They win both houses in the state of North Dakota. The gentleman who wins the governorship, a gentleman named, he was a farmer himself, Lynn Frazier, wins with 79% of the votes. Funnily enough, he's the first American governor to ever be recalled in an election as well. So things don't go too well for the Nonpartisan League, as we'll kind of see out, right? They're going to decline as the kind of agricultural depression worsens, right? The Nonpartisan League is going to be blamed for the agricultural depression, right? You're proposing something very radical, it didn't work, all right, see ya, all right? But they do two pieces of legislation that actually remain intact, right? The first being the Bank of North Dakota in 1919 is established as a state-run bank. It is the depository for all legal state funds. And those funds are used to credit development of agriculturalists, particularly small farmers, as well as small businesses and things of the nature, right? So it's passed in 1919. It is still in operation today. It is the only state-run bank in the United States of America in its history, okay? The state owns the bank. It deposits all of North Dakota's funds into the bank, and they use that to kind of bolster its agricultural and industrial economy. The second is the North Dakota Mill and Elevator, so a granary, a mill site, an elevator. It's passed in 1922, and North Dakota farmers are worried. Again, we're trying to stick it to the middleman, that guy in Chicago, that guy in Minneapolis, because those individuals are charging them high freight costs to ship their wheat to Minneapolis to get sold, right? So they're paying the upfront high freight costs, they're getting low wheat profits, they're essentially making nothing, right? So how do we cut out that middleman? We create a state-run mill. And they do. It's successful, right? We're bypassing Minnesota. It, too, is still in operation today. North Dakota has the only state-run agricultural mill in the United States in its history, right? The state of North Dakota buys grain from North Dakotan farmers, okay? As I said, though, the Nonpartisan League, it's got two crown jewels of its kind of legislative action, and then kaput, right? They're out, okay? They're not able to really remedy the things that are plaguing small farmers, right? It's nice to have a mill, but the prices are still low, right? It's nice to not pay the freight lines cost, but prices are still low, right? They become a pretty easy scapegoat. This is a picture here from their kind of nationally syndicated magazine that they send all across the Midwest and the United States, right? That being said, the Nonpartisan League is, as most historians would agree, myself included, right, probably the most important and most significant agricultural reform movement in the United States' history, right? It's the first time we see in this period where farmers are now viewed as businessmen, right, them reclaiming their ability to make money, okay? It's not successful in the end, but they have some good ideas, some price supports when things get bad. It's also going to inspire more political action among farmers in places across the Midwest, South Dakota, Idaho, and Montana. And it's also going to have a transnational appeal. It's going to inspire a lot of farmer politicians in the Canadian prairies, specifically Alberta and Saskatchewan, are going to take the lessons from the Nonpartisan League, right, and apply it to their own kind of Canadian framework, right? A connection within the hemisphere of kind of agricultural production. So if you got your loony radicals on one side, you've got your more moderate guys on the other, right? And that being the American Farm Bureau, which many of us know well, right? It's founded in 1919 in Chicago, and it's founded, like the Nonpartisan League, with the express goal of forming an organization where farmers can lobby for their own interests, right? In Congress, in state houses all across the country. It is a more moderate reaction to what they saw in places like North Dakota, right? And so they sought to forestall that kind of populist rhetoric that's happening out in North Dakota, right? We don't want that. We don't want that all across the country. The Farm Bureau is going to be the solution to that, right? At the founding meeting in 1919 in Chicago, the president of the Illinois chapter, right, said, "It is our duty in creating this organization to avoid any policy that will align organized farmers with the radicals of other organizations." And as other historians have noted, right, it began as a counter movement to that kind of brewing dissent among small farmers. So if the Nonpartisan League wants kind of state-run facilities, what does the American Farm Bureau want? Well, they want increased profitability for farming across the board, right? We don't want the state to be that involved in the business, but they want us to give us a fair deal, right? To do this, we're going to work on negotiating powers, right? How do we negotiate as a farm bloc? You'll hear that a lot in the minor news, especially when the Farm Bill comes up, right? The farm bloc, what does that mean? It's organizations like this working on behalf of farmers to get a good deal for farmers. They're also going to focus on those cooperatives, right, on agricultural education, about insuring farmers, creating a pool for farmers' insurance, right, that they can pool money together from whatever funds they raise from selling wheat and corn and vice versa, right, to fund insurance for farmers all across the United States. All right, so we'll turn now from what farmers are doing to look at what kind of the federal government is doing in this period. There's many things that prop up in Washington as they do, right, that involve agricultural interests. I'll give you two that are the biggest. The first being, as this kind of picture we'll talk about in a second depicts, is the discussions over what is called the McNary-Hagan Farm Relief Bill. It's passed a series of times in Congress, but as we'll see, it never becomes law, right? It's a congressionally, supported legislative effort to kind of give subsidies to farmers, right? The federal government is not totally unaware of what's happening in the country. We'll talk about next week on February 4th, right, when we talk about the American cities in the 1920s. Things are good there. I mean, mostly. Depends on who you are that we'll talk about. But things are better in the cities, right? So we're not totally blind to the countryside, but we're not that worried about it either, okay? So the individual in the White House is Calvin Coolidge, right? And so he's going to veto this legislation in both 1927 and 1928, based on a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. But what the McNary-Hagan Farm Bill really targeted was 5 specific commodities. It targeted corn, wheat, tobacco, cotton, and rice, right? America's Big Five, as they're often called. And what it did is it wanted federal intervention in the ag economy. It called for foreign tariffs and domestic price supports, right? They wanted to divide up how much food would it take to feed the United States, right? A domestic need, right? Then whatever is over, we'll sell to the world, right? But to pay farmers to make sure that they're making income, we're going to come up with this idea of an equalization payment. What does that mean? Well, when you go to the grocery store, Americans are going to pay more for food to make sure that we have enough money to continue making that food. Not a very popular idea with the people who aren't making the food, that are only buying it, right? And so they're proposing, right, whatever's sold to Americans, we'll charge them an extra surcharge on top of that to make sure that it's profitable to do agriculture, or anything else we'll sell to the world at a normal price, right? They can buy it. Calvin Coolidge, again, not a presidential history, but to give you a broad overview, is an individual who is, if you could sum up his philosophy, it's do as little as possible. Right? He views the federal government as a kind of guiding light, but shouldn't have a heavy hand. Right? Laissez-faire, free economics, right? Let the free market do what it will, let the state stay out of it, right? Kind of fiscal conservatism. And he uses that kind of philosophy to veto these bills twice. So this picture here, right, he's essentially Calvin Coolidge in the little hat with a CC, is arguing amongst the various farm groups and says, if you can't agree on a solution, ask Santa Claus. He'll figure it out for you, right? We're going to veto your legislation. You worry it for yourself, right? You sink, you swim, the free market decides, okay? He was worried, moreover, that it was going to be unconstitutional, that it would guarantee that the federal government would always be involved in this kind of price fixing, and he also worried that it was going to hurt the national economy. So not only does Calvin Coolidge think that himself, but he's got business leaders in his ear telling him that as well, right? If my workers have to pay more for food, they're going to demand higher wages at the factory. I can't have that, right? So he sides with business interests, he sides with himself, and he vetoes it. Despite it passing both the House and Senate pretty unanimously both times. They didn't have enough to overturn the veto, but it does, pass twice, okay? What it does, if its legacy, is it kind of divides the Republican farm bloc. At this point, most farmers are Republicans, okay? They're interested in Republican politicians. But on one side of the Republican Party, you've got all these farmers. On the other side, you've got the business interests. And now they don't see eye to eye, right? There's going to be some problems. Calvin Coolidge's own vice president, Dawes, right, supports the McNary-Hagan Farm Bill. His own vice president, right? Sedition within the own White House. They don't get into too many fights about it, though. It's also going to anger farmers across the Midwest in particular, right? In 1928, we're going to see a variety of protests at state houses of farmers demanding that they override Calvin Coolidge's veto. And it's what the Calvin Coolidge and his kind of ilk are arguing, though, is that the state shouldn't be involved, right? That we should focus more on agribusiness. Those who can survive to get bigger should get bigger. Those who can't should not be farmers anymore. They wanted to have rural education for individuals that are farmers, right? Those of you who can remain big enough to continue farming, let's teach you how to do it the best way, right? That you can always be in that kind of profit margin. But what this does, and what we'll talk about in the next couple weeks, is that it's going to lay the foundation for FDR to come into the White House in 1932, look at the farmers and say, hey, remember at the Republican Party kind of, gave you the backhand? Well, the New Deal government will make sure that you have those price supports, that we have the ability to keep small farmers in farming, right? This is going to be very popular for FDR that we'll talk about when he wins the election in 1932. The second and last thing we'll talk about today is the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill that was passed in 1930, right? We will definitely talk about this in March, okay? If you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when the teacher's teaching and he goes, the Hawley-Smoot tariff bill, anybody know it? We'll watch that clip, all right? This is what I tell my students all the time, right? They have no idea what Ferris Bueller's Day Off is, but some of them find the clip kind of funny. When they're like staring at the teacher like that, glazed over, that's the look I usually get as well. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff bill, without going into too much detail, is a kind of a Republican-supported tariff package that's going to protect, what they're arguing, America's farmers and American industries, right? It's going to target 20,000 individual commodities, and it's going to raise the tariff levels to an average of 60%, quite a bit, right? And what this does, and it's implemented in 1930 as kind of a reaction to the stock market crash that we'll talk about later, but they thought that it was going to help American farmers and American industries. Farmers themselves, like I said, right, Calvin Coolidge said he wouldn't do it. Herbert Hoover has a different idea. Maybe we'll do a little price supports, tariffs being one of those, are very in support of this tariff package, right? Farmers from all across the country, and I've read some of the congressional reports, right? They had a station set up in Detroit where congressmen came and heard the testimony of farmers, many of them being Ohioans, right? Ohio Farm Association, the corn growers, the beef producers, the Onion Association, right? All testified before Congress. This package will save the industry, right? Europe has recovered. It's now producing those goods that we're selling. In the case of onions, right, Spain exports its onions to the United States at the same time American Midwestern farmers were picking their onions, right? Can't have that, right? So we're going to tariff that. We're in support of it. Farmers thought that it was going to be, a good thing for them. But if you know anything about the Hawley-Smoot tariff bill, then it's not good for anybody, okay? It's going to actually deepen the Great Depression. What it does is that because the United States is now applying that 60% tariff to all foreign exports, well, the foreign countries are going to say, I'll put my own tariff on American products, right? So it's contradictory in its terms, right? It's going to make the Great Depression worse, and it's going to hurt farmers even more, right? Canada, for instance, is going to levy a tariff against the United States in response to the Hawley-Smoot tariff bill. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, all of them, right, are going to join in on this tariff frenzy, okay? And it's going to be followed by that international retaliation, right? Well, why is America putting a 60% tariff on me? I'll put one on you, right? It's going to make the Depression worse, both in the United States and globally, and it's also going to impact farmers pretty hard, right? Not only did you lose that market, now you've lost even more of it, right? And so now we're going to have, at the start of the Great Depression in 1929 and onward through the end of the 30s, right, this constant overproduction and surplus of agricultural goods. What do we do with all this extra corn? What do we do with all this wheat? What do we do with all this pork, right? Some people are going to have solutions. We'll see how well or how effective they were. And so, with the last couple seconds here, we'll talk about some of the legacies of this lesson. Why start here? Why does it matter? Well, the most important one is that the first victims, really, of the Great Depression, right, are America's farmers. The agricultural depression that I gave you the synopsis over, right, is not connected per se, right, in the Great Depression. But what it does is it means that American farmers suffer for 2 decades, not one, in the Great Depression, right? It's going to hollow out the middle of the country, right? More people are going to continue, as we saw in 2025, it's a disparity of 80 to 20%, right? Leave the countryside for economic opportunity in the city. American farmers will only recover fully, as the nation does, right, with the onset of the Second World War, which we'll talk about in December, right? Another war brings American agriculture back to exporting around the world. We're going to feed the Allies again in our noble pursuit to rid the world of fascism, right, in Europe. It's also, importantly, as we talk about FDR in the next coming weeks, is going to lay the foundation for farmers to argue that we want federal intervention in agriculture, right? We had Calvin Coolidge, it didn't work. We had Herbert Hoover, somehow he made it worse, right? But FDR is promising us through this New Deal for America, right, that we have the price supports necessary to get us a good payment for our agricultural products. And as we'll see, right, a lot of the issues of the 1920s countryside are not going to be fixed until the 1930s, right? As David Kennedy, kind of the foremost expert on the Great Depression, he teaches at Stanford. His book is fantastic. It's like 1,100 pages, though. You don't have to read that for homework. But, right, David Kennedy is going to argue that the countryside, by the end or the start of the Great Depression, right, where we left off 1930, looks no different than it did in 1890. They have no electricity. Right? The industries are not as good as they are in these kind of Rust Belt cities, right? That the way of life has always been the same for folks as it was at the turn of the century, right? It's going to be a real challenge for the federal government of the United States to fix the issues facing rural America. We'll talk about rural electrification in 1935, right? It's going to bring lights to the countryside. It's going to try not only to fix these problems with the ag economy, but fix rural life as in general, right? Bring them up to speed. Try to stop that rural exodus. So as I mentioned, next Wednesday, February 4th, 6 p.m., we'll talk about the same period, the 1920s, but we'll take a step back and look at the cities, right? What did the cities look like? Was it actually as good as people say it was, right? Was it really roaring? And that'll be here, again, thanks to the museum, 6 to 7, right? I work at Carter Historic Farm, Wood County Park District. It's a great partnership that we've got going on here. I just threw some information about that. If you want to come see us, we interpret the 1920s and 1930s, actively, right? I give talks like this, but I also do kind of the work to show people what it was like to live and toil in that kind of period, right? And also, if you do want to read some more, if this interested you, at the end of all these lectures, I'll give you some further reading. So feel free to take a picture of this slide. These are some of the best books that I've found in my own research that kind of talk about the changing conditions of American agriculture. So if anybody has any questions, I'll stay for questions for a few minutes. If not, I appreciate you so much for coming, and I hope to see you in the next couple of months. So thank you. Yeah.